Sisters and brothers, if we can come in and get seated, we want to start right on time. Thank you.
Hello. Good afternoon, sisters and brothers. My name is Charlotte West, and I'm a member of the Economic Equity and Jobs Task Force with NOAA, and we are proud to co-host today's forum with our community partners. We are especially grateful to NOAA member organization Word of Life Church. They have generously offered out their building so that we could use it for this opportunity. All of us can see the city changing every day, and the latest news about the redevelopment along the East Bank and the Titan Stadium will bring even more changes. A lot of press releases have been written and published, and yet there are many, many details that will impact us as residents of Nashville. We deserve to understand them. So we are here today with this distinguished panel to try to get some questions answered. I will now turn the moderating duties over to David Plassis, editor of the Tennessean. David, thank you for agreeing to help us today.
Ms. West, thank you very much for having me here, and thank you for all the organizations. There we go. And thank you for all the organizations who've organized this together. This is such an important community conversation. I love the title of it, A New Stadium for Nashville with question mark. This is a really important question because I think many of us have more questions than answers today, although these panelists may have more answers than I have for you today. So I'll briefly introduce each of them and then start with the questions. And at the end of this, we will have a community Q&A, and please think about what you want to ask. So first we have Paulette Coleman, who's an MDHA commissioner. Let's welcome Paulette here, and longtime leader in NOAA. We have Bob Mendez, at-large Metro Council member in his second term. And Mandy Pellegrin, Deputy Director of the Sycamore Institute. wanted to ask all three of you to please frame the issue of the Titan Stadium from your unique vantage points. And what are you hearing from either the community, your constituents, or the people that you talk to on a regular basis? Let's start with Paulette. Please frame the issue of the Titan Stadium for us.
First of all, I will not discuss the issue exclusively in terms of the Titans. We're not taking a comprehensive look at East Bank development that is just economic, and equitable, then we don't have a conversation. Because if you focus only on the Titans Stadium, then we don't get very far. If I were to say what the focus should be, it would be people and affordable housing. I would also say that the people, and they are a variety with whom I've spoken, are wondering how will we ever be able to direct the enthusiasm, the money, and so forth and so on that has gone into the development of our sports complex here in Nashville, the totality of it, not just the Titans, to things like affordable housing, livable wages, etc. So that's just a very important factor to me. And I would also say, I also fully embrace the UN Declaration of Human Rights of 1949 that described housing as a fundamental and inalienable human right. So it's not just a local or a national issue, it is an international necessity because it impacts so many other things. I have other things to say about it, but we can probably cover them.
Thank you very much. And Councilman, thank you. Councilman, you've written quite a bit about this in your blog. You've shared it on Twitter. Would you frame the issue for us from your vantage point?
Sure. So to start with, so this is the biggest project in terms of dollars that the city's ever participated in. The convention center costs $623 million, and we're talking about $2 billion here. So it's a big deal. And so far, like all economic development deals, before the terms are actually announced, it's a private conversation between the mayor's office and the party involved, the Titans. And so in the council, we're in the same spot that the public is right now. We might have front row seats to watching the negotiation, but the public and the council are in the stands watching, waiting for the negotiations to come to an end so we can find out what the actual deal is. And, you know, we hear a lot of people in the public believe that it's a done deal. It's going to happen. It's over. We are getting a new stadium. And and there's a reason for that. The reason is that the PR machines of both the mayor's office and the team have been pumping out hard that this is a done deal. But they selectively leak parts of the deal, and there's other parts that don't get leaked that we'll have to come up with at some point. So my frame of reference as an at-large council member, as chair of the council's committee that will look at the stadium deal whenever it's announced, is my view is we need to bring the public and the council to be on an equal footing with information as the team and the mayor's office, and do it in a way that puts everybody in a position to decide whether they like it or don't like it. One of the main narratives that has changed from the PR leaks over the course of the last 9 months is at the beginning of the year, in a piece the Tennessean did in the first week of January, the mayor is quoted as saying, "We need a new neighborhood on the East Bank in order to build a stadium." And then by May, a couple reporters had started adding the cost of the stadium and the East Bank infrastructure, and we're getting numbers over $3 billion between the two of them. And the mayor's PR machine started saying, "Oh, no, East Bank is totally separate from the stadium. They're totally separate things. Think about them separately." And that's one example of, before we get to the deal, I view it as my job to try to make sure people understand what's spin and make sure that we've got all the information available. As far as what I'm hearing from the public, again, a lot of people feel like it's a done deal. And then a lot of people, if they drill deeper, either have a strong feeling for or a strong feeling against. But my sense is that that doesn't really come from a place of information. It comes from, I think, pre-baked conclusions about whether you like these sort of things or not. Because you couldn't have an opinion on a deal that hasn't been announced yet. So I hope that we can get more information to the public once a deal is actually announced and let people make an informed decision about whether to support it or not.
Thank you very much. And Mandy Pellegrin, the Sycamore Institute has done some incredible research over the last few years on state budget figures, issues with healthcare outcomes and affordable housing, all these things. From your vantage point, could you talk about how you frame the issue and how you see the issue?
Sure. So just a little bit about who we are first. We're a nonpartisan policy research center, and really we're a bipartisan staff. And we focus mostly on state policy issues, but we get into local policy issues when it's related to state budget issues. And we really feel like our role in the policymaking process is just to provide good, solid, impartial information to the extent that a human can be impartial, or a set of humans, so that you can bring your values to that information and decide where you land. So we don't take positions on things, we are neutral on things. We are just here to kind of lay out the information so that you can understand it and highlight the trade-offs, and then you decide how you feel or how you want to vote or whatever it is. So in this situation, we came to the topic because we do a lot of state budget work, and over the last couple of years, just 2 years alone, state policymakers have approved public subsidies for at least 5 sports venues, professional sports venues, not counting, universities across the state. And so someone came to us and said, we really feel like these folks need to kind of get a very basic education on how these economic impact numbers work. So we took a look at what these deals look like in Tennessee, what these deals look like in other places, why do policymakers justify doing it, what does the research say about their economic benefits, and really the non-quantifiable benefits as well. And so that's kind of our role. So our paper on this covers all kinds of subsidies across Tennessee related to stadiums, but obviously this is sort of the big guy in the room and how we got involved in the issue.
Very good. And I do want to find more about your research. Where can they go?
SycamoreTN.org.
Very good. I'd like to turn over to Paulette Coleman again to talk about, you mentioned affordable housing and people, and we've seen the trends in Nashville over the last several years. I've written quite a bit about displacement in Nashville because of the widening gap of income inequality. Would you talk about your own concerns specific to affordable housing and as it affects that area and maybe other areas of the community?
Yeah. One of the things that's very interesting about the whole East Bank is we have 338 acres, okay? And 230 of those acres are asphalt and industrial kinds of things. So there are not a lot of residences. And even in the imagined East Bank, they said there were 0 housing units in the East Bank. Now, that bothers me a bit because Casey is a part of it, and there are considerably more than 0 units. There are approximately 12,000 people, however, who live within a half-mile radius of the East Bank. So what does that mean? On one level, we could say, well, there are not a lot of people being displaced, but the other piece of it is that the impact of the redevelopment of the East Bank just isn't going to occur in the East Bank. There are going to be ramifications in the surrounding area. So for example, east of the East Bank, you have Sycamore and Napier, okay? So what's going to happen there? Even if we just look at the area encompassed by the East Bank, we all know the traffic, we all know all of these other things that exist at Nissan Stadium now. So what are we going to do about that? The other thing that's problematic for me about the plan for the East Bank, and remember, I'm a proponent of comprehensive economic community development. It does not occur in isolation. In addition to that, if you look at the report very carefully, it talks about it will have 20,000 units of housing, okay? But if you go further, it says 20% or 4,000 will be affordable. Well, when you look even closer, they're going to be 500, again, this is the early proposal, but it's disturbing. Okay, thank you. They're going to be 500 units at 30% of AMI, 1,500 at 31 to 60% of AMI, and 2,000 at 61 to 80%. AMI is area median income, and that's a term and a process that HUD uses for determining affordability. But even in the numbers that are there, they're only going to be 4,000 of what may be called generously affordable housing. So that's a big concern to me. In addition, when I looked at the four components, Nissan Stadium is proposing 90 acres with 0 units. Oracle is having 70 acres with 0 units. KC Place has 63 acres, and they're 2,390 or 2,400 units. And then the 111 North has 15 acres with 0 units. So even in the preliminary planning and even in the documentation that we have, there is no provision for anything more than approximately 2,400 housing units. So that is of grave concern to me, because very frequently where you start is where you end up in projects like this. So the other thing that is of concern to me are the projections of the jobs. There's supposed to be approximately 50,000 jobs created, but 21,000 are projected in the Imagine Nashville report to be construction jobs, which are temporary and which may or may not lead to any kind of a career path. So those are the kinds of things that are of concern to me. I mean, this is nothing, you don't have to be a high level economist or planner. These are just looking at the numbers and what the report says. It is very dismal in terms of what housing will come out of the project as presently. And this is looking at the totality, not just the stadium. And I have some suggestions about what we might want to do in terms of more creative thinking about it.
So we'll get to those suggestions in just a little bit. I did want to turn to you, Councilman, because you have asked a question before about what would Mayor Cooper do if he were a councilman still. And certainly in this case, you've certainly brought up the issue about would this have been a deal that he would have frowned upon or he would have embraced? And could you talk a little about that? And especially since you have offered so much financial expertise, elaborate, please.
Sure. You know, I guess I am probably guilty of wondering what he would have done as a council person. Fundamentally, I'm not sure that that's a relevant question. Certainly, the mayor voted against, I think, all but one economic development deals last term when he was a council member, and he definitely campaigned on moving economic development out of downtown. That's in his policy manual that I think exists online at WPLN's website now. And there was a lot of questioning that he did consistently, along with other of us in the council last term, about who's paying for what. And that's fundamentally one of the things we don't know right now. We don't know who's paying for what. We do know that the state has authorized $500 million worth of general obligation bond money supported by all our tax dollars. We do know that the state of Tennessee has made it so if we build a new stadium, we're required to have all the sales tax from the stadium be dedicated to support paying for it. We do know that the state of Tennessee has passed a law forcing us that if we build a new stadium for a 130-acre zone, and like 130 acres, it's hard to imagine. If you look at the East Bank between the bridges, between where the football stadium is now, that's the 130 acres. So half the sales tax from that entire area would go to support building a new stadium pursuant to state law. And that's you can look at the pictures, they're imagining 15, 20-story, 30-story buildings, and half the sales tax goes to support a new stadium. We do know the state has passed a law to force it. If we build a stadium, there's a 1% of hotel occupancy tax that can only be used to support a stadium. And even if we don't have a lot of choice because the state passed these laws, saying that if you build a stadium, these funds will be committed. It will add up to be the biggest city-state spending on a football stadium or any kind of stadium in the history of the United States of America. The current leader is New York and Buffalo have committed something like $850 million to build a new football stadium for the Buffalo Bills. And between the state and local spend here, the guesstimate is something like $1.2 billion. So it will be the biggest public spend ever, which is a weird thing for the state of Tennessee, and especially forced by laws from our very right-leaning legislature to force on us. And the idea of having over $1 billion worth of public spend, state and local, on a football stadium is a thing that typically I would have expected last term for Mayor Cooper to oppose. Again, the more relevant question is whether we're going to oppose it. And when we finally get the deal announced, and we get told what I'm sure y'all know about, we've got a lease obligation under the current lease to improve it, the stadium to first-class condition. That is a real obligation. You know, I'm sure it's a headwind to get public support to know that 25 years ago, a $300 million stadium was built, where 23 years later, there's supposedly $1 billion+ maintenance obligation. And it's really, you know, I think it makes a lot of people scratch their heads when they put it in those terms, like, okay, if building a $300 million building in 1990 something equals $1 billion+ obligation now for maintenance, like, holy hell, I shouldn't say that in here. Pardon me. Heck, you know, what's the obligation 20 years down the road on a $2 billion building? And these are, you know, put this in the question category. You know, put this in the, you know, we don't see the news leaks about this, but people are going to want to know about that. And then separately, there's supposedly going to be $500 million, $700 million of non-stadium infrastructure in the East Bank area that will have to come out of general obligation bonds, purely metro obligation. And these are just really big numbers, biggest public project ever in the city of Nashville, other than maybe the Ford plant, the biggest public project ever in the state of Tennessee. And people are going to want to kick the tires hard about it.
Oh, thank you so much. Manny Pellegrin, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the state budget itself, because the state has certainly pitched itself as a conservative-leaning, fiscally conservative state. And I'm not asking to talk about the politics, but rather about the reality of the numbers. In the last several years, we've had everything from different economic development deals like Amazon, like Oracle. We've had federal money because of COVID. And so could you help us understand, you know, whether or not, first of all, the state is in a position to further invest in these economic development projects, and what the forecast is in the years ahead?
As David said, the state has always been fiscally conservative, even when Democrats were in charge. When it comes to the state budget, policymakers have always been quite conservative. So we have a balanced budget requirement. So if you don't project your revenues accurately and you end up with a deficit in the middle of the fiscal year, that means you have to end up cutting things in the middle of the fiscal year, or raise taxes in the middle of the fiscal year, which nobody wants, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on. So you err on the other side, right? You under project your revenues, you end up with large surpluses, and you can still spend those dollars. It kind of delays your multi-year investments by a year, but you end up with a surplus that you can spend in a one-time way. So going into the pandemic, sort of keeping with the trend, the state was very, very conservative on budgeting for the next year as the pandemic hit. Kind of froze everything in place, planned to cut back a lot of things, planned to draw on a bunch of reserves. And in the end, the economic impacts were pretty swift, and then we had massive amounts of federal money being pumped into the economy. So what ended up happening is the state's revenues did not get impacted in the way that they thought that they would, and so they ended up with very large surpluses over the last couple of fiscal years, and already a surplus into this fiscal year. So there has been a lot of sort of one-time money available to do things like pay for the incentive for the Ford plant that you talked about, put money into capital projects, and this is one of those things, is $500 million. Well, I actually say that, and it is not used from a surplus. It will be funded actually over the next several decades, $55 million a year until this $500 million bond is paid off. But that $55 million is coming from this surplus. So.
Thank you very much. I want to continue just in terms of the issue of where the money comes from. Stand Up Nashville recently released a report showing that people were not supportive of a publicly funded stadium. So this is the question. We've talked a little bit about the fact we have state money through the bonds, we have city money, maybe $700 or $800 million in private money, and so the issue is not as much the stadium as it is who pays for it. And this is a question for all of you, and I invite anyone, perhaps first the councilman, and then if anyone else wants to comment on that.
Well, in this thread of, I view my job as to, especially before a deal gets announced, to try to call some balls and strikes on the spin. One of the, and I'm making a little bit of progress, but not a lot, but what you hear from the parties in the negotiation is that this is essentially found money. The public spend is found money. Like, it's a parking lot now, it's no sales tax. If we get any sales tax, that's gravy. And we'll hear the same thing when it comes to wanting to issue several $100 million worth of GO bonds for infrastructure around the stadium. It's a parking lot. It's not earning any property taxes. It's all free money. It's all found money. And that is fundamentally, and I invite anybody to Google the academic research on this going back 30, 40 years. It's, if you ask economists, it's bunk, it's nonsense, it's words I can't say in this building. It is not true. When you build something from scratch, it's not just found money. And I sit in my office, in my law office in the Pinnacle building, and I eat lunch now on the downtown side of the river, and my sales tax for my lunch gets captured into paying for the convention center now. If we go fast forward 6 years and I go walk across a pedestrian bridge and buy lunch on the other side of the river, I take my sales tax money away from the convention center into paying for a football stadium. If somebody is going to stay now in the Omni and their 1% or whatever their sales tax is goes into the convention center capture pool and they go stay in a new hotel across the street, then the money goes over there. It's not found money. It's not found money. And that's a thing that no matter, so first of all, the idea that it's free to Nashville, the general taxpayer doesn't have to pay for it, is fundamentally false, and I invite anybody to look at the academic research from economists on this, and I think we actually have somebody more of an expert on it than me up here. And then further, I'll get back to the thing I said before. No matter how you slice it, this will be the biggest public spend on a stadium in the history of the United States of America. And the idea that that's free to us just can't be true. It fails any measure of common sense. And so there's going to be a lot of private money. There's going to be a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of places where our hands are already tied by state laws that exist, that we have to commit certain revenues if we build a new stadium. But the notion that it's free to us, free to taxpayers, is just false. And I'm going to keep pushing on that as hard as I need to.
You know, related to this, I wanted to ask anybody on the panel, you know, I've heard quite a bit when I've been out in the community that how is this going to benefit me when I've spoken in Bellevue, when I've spoken in Bordeaux, elsewhere. How am I going to benefit from this if I don't live there, if I don't work for the team? And I don't know if Paulette Coleman, if you'd like to take that on?
Well, I think that's a common question, and it's a relevant one in the sense that, and that's the thing that I have heard as well. I have heard people say it's only going to create problems for me, and there is no benefit whatsoever. And since there is not any intentionality about housing and people, I am very, very concerned in how we're so anxious to remove the stadium from a broader discussion of that entire East Bank community. The major reaction of people is, how can we spend that much money on something that will only benefit the PSL holders, the subscribers, and the attendees at the games, and that there will be an adverse impact on my quality of life, even if I'm not within that 300 acres. It's just how it is now.
And related from an economic point of view, if we could talk for a moment, whether generally or specifically about the impact of sports stadiums on communities. Mandy, could you talk a little bit about that, whether it's for the Tennessee front or nationally? We certainly have teams from the Memphis Grizzlies to Nashville SC, which is the latest soccer stadium, possibly Major League Baseball at some point. That's another conversation altogether. But could you talk a little bit about that impact, and do they actually help their communities?
So you did a lovely job explaining my research. No, you did do a lovely job. I mean, this is, like you said, an area where economists pretty much universally agree, which is not common, that these things just don't pay for themselves from a public subsidy standpoint, because there is, like you said, no free money. Think of it as sort of a closed system. Each of us only spends so much money per year on eating out, on going to shows, on going to movies. And, you know, if I have a new entertainment option, I don't suddenly have $1,500 more per year to spend. I'm going to redistribute that spending from something else. So when you're talking about something that's kind of a bigger draw, like an NFL stadium, you might be drawing in actually economic activity from counties surrounding Davidson County, where people aren't actually spending their money in rural areas anymore. Now they're spending their money in Nashville, which might be something good for Nashville. But you know, the economics there are quite different if you're a state policymaker, if you're a local policymaker. Something like an NFL stadium and a covered one, which is what folks are talking about now, is this idea that you're going to bring in these big one-time events like the Super Bowl or the World Cup, and that brings in all this new activity, because these are people that wouldn't normally come to Nashville, wouldn't normally come to Tennessee. There's actually a lot of really interesting research outside of sort of the core economic impact stuff about, how does it affect residents? Like me, am I going to probably get out of town if the Super Bowl is in town? Probably. So that's economic activity that's being pulled out of Nashville because this thing is in town. Often cities and states separately subsidize these very large events. There's been talk about subsidizing conventions that come to town. We'll think about something as big as the Super Bowl or the World Cup. And then you do have these economic impacts on the areas sort of right outside the center of these huge events, where even if I do stay in town, maybe I don't go to my local restaurant because I'm scared to leave my house because I think there might be too many out. And you actually negatively impact these businesses on the periphery of this massive one-time kind of activity. And then you also have to make sure that that activity it's all contingent upon that money recirculating in the economy. And a lot of times these big events bring in outside companies, outside vendors, and so the money is really just kind of going to outside businesses that don't stay in Tennessee.
A definitions question for the panel.
Yeah.
We hear a lot about direct spending versus economic impact. For people who may not know that, what does that mean and what's the difference?
So the direct spending would be you come to town and you spend money at the stadium on tickets, on food at the stadium, on parking around the stadium. Then you have your spending that's associated with your trip to town or your trip to downtown, so at the restaurants there. And then the idea is, okay, so you have more activity, more business for those restaurants. Those restaurants are hiring more employees. They're buying more supplies from suppliers, and that's good for those people. Then the employees are making more money, and all this money is recirculating within the economy. And actually, if you think of it, if you compare it to an economic development incentive, it's very similar, but it's actually one step away from an economic development incentive, because stadium deals don't really create many new jobs on their own from the direct spending, because you're just having an event every couple of weeks, and these are temporary employees. In fact, a lot of stadiums rely on volunteers to man things, so you're really one step away even from your traditional economic development incentive.
So just a question, maybe this will be to the councilman, because I'm doing some math in my head and I'm starting to confuse myself, unfortunately, so you're gonna have to help me on this. So a certain amount of revenue goes to pay for the stadium if it gets done, but what happens if the city has a need when it comes to public education or to affordable housing or something else? How do those monies get generated, essentially?
Well, and let me just emphasize something that Mandy said. It is zero exaggeration to say that the field of professional economists who run the spectrum from far left to far right universally agree that public spending on stadium doesn't provide a return on investment. Universally, Google it, check it out. That's zero exaggeration. The team in the mayor's office know that deep down inside, which is why so much of the pitch to the public has been, well, we've got this giant obligation, maybe $1 billion, on the horrible lease we signed 20 years ago. It wasn't us, it was the previous people sitting in our seats. And like, heck, even if it doesn't pay for itself, and the entire world of economists are right, well, heck, we still need to do it because we have this giant lease obligation. That's, I think, where the action's at on whether we fundamentally, as a group, believe that there is a massive lease obligation or not. And as far as spending on everything else that we need to do, whether it's transit or education or affordable housing, and I shouldn't say and all these things, the reality is that a new stadium is not going to generate extra revenue to do that stuff any more than the existing stadium did. We've had a football stadium and a pro football team for 20 years. Arguably, we're more behind on education and infrastructure spending now than we were when the stadium got built. Like, if that, and we know that some other folks were sitting on a panel in 1990, whatever, saying the same things, saying that it was going to help us pay for the things we need to do. And that really, I mean, that's the thing that I hear Nashvillians since I've been in office in 2015, like, for most regular folks, the fundamental deal was that let's build downtown to be A+ superstar downtown, and it'll help us pay for the things we need to do. And meanwhile, our roads are busted up and the water fountains don't work in our kids' school, and so objectively, like that bargain that got made 20 years ago turned out to not be true, and that makes people wary about whether this is a magical deal that is going to fix all our problems, I think.
Yeah, so Paul Coleman, you were eager to say something.
I wanted to add one thing. It's not only in the U.S. that stadiums have proven not to be of great benefit. It's basically an international phenomenon that they don't result in additional revenue to do the things that are sorely needed by communities. The other thing I wanted to say is that it's very important to look at what benefits we have derived, as Councilman said, from the existing stadium. And I'm sure there's a question mark, and there's some who would say that we haven't really derived that many, unless you're a big and avid fan of the professional football team. I think what cities don't often do, there's a certain glitziness, there's a certain panache about having, a cachet rather, about having a football stadium. And if we as a city don't have our identity concretely in place, that could be alluring. And in terms of either or, if we don't get the stadium, we won't, it's not that simple in terms of whether it's either or. But I do appreciate the reminder that the stadium, whatever revenue, if there's any, do not benefit the basic needs of our community, whether it's housing, transportation, education, cultural, et cetera.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the affordable housing report that came out recently from the mayor's office and about the need. That is, I remember when I was starting to cover these issues, there was a need of 18,000 affordable housing units back in 2017. That has now risen to 58,000. And so it's a massive increase in just 5 years. Looking down the road, we're looking 8, 10 years down the road, what are some of your projections, fears, and maybe any optimism you might have about what's to come? And well, why don't we start with the councilman and go here, and go to the others.
Well, the fears are easy to describe. You know, I think a lot of us who've lived, I've lived here since the mid-90s. A lot of you have lived here longer than I have. And, you know, I think as a city, we understood what we were doing. from the mid-90s till through the Dean administration. Whether everybody bought in or not, we were building the heck out of downtown to make it into this A++ tourism destination, and it was going to pay for the things we need to do. And so by the end of the Dean administration, like, check that box, we did it. You know, we built the A+ destination, and we weren't paying for the things we need to do. And then, you know, between craziness in politics at the national level and turnover in the mayor's office, I'm on my third mayor in 7 years in office, third finance director, third legal director, third council director, third or fourth transportation department director. Between that turnover and COVID, none of us could say there's really any progress on figuring out what the goal is for the next generation in Nashville. And so without consensus on what we're trying to do, it's hard, as Paulette said, to make decisions about what we invest in. And you know, I think most Nashvillians would love to have a totally built-out East Bank if we can afford it. But I mean, there's an if there, and it's just not clear. I don't think there's consensus that we're going to pull that off. And then the concern is that meandering without a goal, you know, makes us have unchecked, irregular, uneven, disparate growth.
Thank you. Paulette, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I think it is very important that our city identity, that we as Nashvillians, politicians, regular citizens, arrive at some consensus of who we are and, more importantly, who we want to be. Secondly, the affordable housing crisis is growing, and the span from 18,000 to 58 in a short period of time is very distressing. Unless we begin to eliminate the barriers to the production and the preservation, it's just going to grow more. We need a singular focus on a comprehensive community economic development strategy, process, orientation for Nashville that includes housing, transportation, quality of life, employment, the whole spectrum of what it takes to have a good city. I am encouraged by several things, but again, they're moving much too slowly. It has taken us 7 years of advocacy to get an Office of Housing within the planning department. 7, okay? And all of you have been to the numerous forums, et cetera, have testified, have signed petitions, and the like. The next thing that is encouraging is progress is being made with MDHA and the city working more closely around the redevelopment of Casey, more discussions about the other Envision type plans, but those are very, very long term, and they won't impact the totality of our affordable housing need. So while there are some glimmers of hope, there's still a lot more work to be done. And for me, sometimes I think of the stadium, not necessarily East Bank development, as a distraction to the overall needs that we have that will greatly benefit our citizens.
I wanted to ask Mindy Pellegrin a little bit about economic forecasting. Yeah, please go ahead. So we know there's been a lot of interesting data with regard to where our economy is going. We've seen a decline in growth in the American economy. We've seen interest rates go up again, another 0.75%. There is belief that there could be a recession at some point in the near future. What does this mean for the economy of Tennessee and Nashville as we try to plan for our growth?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, I think that we do have a lot of policymakers in place right now that don't know what it's like during a recession, that don't know what it's like to govern during that kind of of rough time, and when you are talking about a recession, one of your worst investments could probably be tourist development. And so, you know, we have had the longest period of economic expansion in at least a century. And so I think that gets policymakers very comfortable with the state of revenues, with the state of policymaking, and everything feels like an opportunity. And there's definitely some forgetting of what dealing with really inflation also, because once inflation hits, is very difficult to budget because you don't know how far your revenue dollars are going to go, because everything you're spending money on is also increasing in price at a very rapid pace, so your dollars just don't go as far. I mean, I will add that, you know, when we explored this topic, we kind of, you know, most of the pages are dedicated to reviewing the economic evidence. We do acknowledge that it's not always just about the numbers. I mean, if you listen to the debate on this topic at the state legislature, for example, you will hear a lot of the stuff about the economic impact, which is really gross impact and not net impact. But, I mean, there is some political argument to be made of just, you know, if this is a thing that Tennessee wants, or that Nashville wants because it wants to be an NFL city, or it wants to be a Super Bowl state, then I think, you know, that's fair. Policymaking is not all science. It's a lot of art as well. I think, you know, from our perspective, we just like to see things kind of treated fairly, and we'd like to see that acknowledgement that if this is a thing that we want and we're willing to spend money on it, and we're willing to not spend that money on other needs that we might have, then that's perfectly acceptable, perhaps, if that's what your constituents want as well, but that's something that we should acknowledge. And acknowledge, you know, what kind of Nashville that makes us, and who that makes us for, and how that affects our other priorities.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to go to one more question from me and then open it up to the community Q&A. I do want to acknowledge some of the elected officials in the room. I think we have at-large Council Member Sharon Hurt, who's here, at-large Council Member Berkeley Allen. We have Sulfat Swara, Brett Withers, I believe, is here. Jenny Welsh is here. And where else? Emily Benedict is here. And so, anyone else? Oh, Freddie O'Connell, of course.
Russ Bradford.
Oh, I'm sorry, Russ Bradford. I apologize.
Aaron Evans.
Am I missing Aaron Evans? I'm sorry. Who am I also missing?
Oh, Quante Toombs.
Quincy Toombs.
We have a quorum.
Well, let's vote.
Oh, Delisha Porterfield. I'm sorry. I apologize about that. Joyce Stiles. I didn't recognize you in the mask, Councilwoman. So, thank you all for coming here. This is a very important conversation, and there are many more answers that we need, I think. That's one thing we found. So this advocacy work is so important. So I commend NOAA, Nashville, SEIU, all the different partners that have been a part of this to make this happen. So I wanted to ask you about what lessons we've learned or haven't learned from the Nashville SC Stadium building, which opened just on May 1st. What are the things that we see as areas that we need to ask these questions? What are areas that worked relatively well to help guide this process if this conversation continues?
Because I don't think that there's been much learning from my perspective in terms of meeting the needs of Nashvillians and affordable housing and job development. So I have to think about that.
Well, I mean, this is low-hanging fruit. It's too bad that this had to be a lesson learned. But there was a debate on the soccer stadium about whether the team would cover cost overruns, and that ended up being $75 million. They did take on the cost overruns, and I think this negotiation has started from the assumption that the team will definitely pay cost overruns. And given the fact that the baseball stadium started out at 60, ended up at 90, the soccer stadium ended up at 325 after being budgeted 250 million, like on a $2 billion deal, just the covering the cost overruns is a big deal. And I think there's a locked-in assumption that the team is covering cost overruns. Beyond that, you know, this is frankly, I mean, this is 8-9 times the size of the soccer stadium deal before you get into the infrastructure for the surrounding area. And so it's an order, literally an order of magnitude bigger, and I think it's a mistake to try to make them be cookie cutter, one like the other, because I think the extra zero on the numbers adds some pretty intense complexity.
And just added to that, there was a conversation of community benefits agreement as well in Nashville SC. Has any of that come up as part of this discussion from what you've heard? And I'm sure from the side of the labor unions that has come up, but if that has been an issue policy-wise.
I mean, I'll do a straight talk express on this. For the soccer stadium, there were some votes that required 27 votes, and due to fairground-specific things. And the football stadium will require 21 votes, not 27. And I would argue that there ended up being a community benefits agreement because there were enough council members in the council who wanted it to make a 27 vote threshold impossible without one. And it's not clear where the council will be on that. And if the council does enforce it, I think the team's intention is to provide what they consider to be a voluntary package of community benefits that is not a negotiated thing or subject to a written agreement. And so all the action is in the council last time, they couldn't get to 27 votes without getting a community benefits agreement. Can they get to 21 votes without one? I think probably so. At least the team thinks so, because they're intent on offering a voluntary package rather than entering an agreement.
Well, thank you very much. With that, let's open it up to any community Q&A if you might have. I don't know if we have a microphone or, there we go. We have note cards. It could be brought up here. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing
Does anyone want to ask a question on their own, or we have some that you can read from the crowd? You want to ask?
speeches.
So the question is, do we know who's advising the mayor, given that he doesn't have an ECD director?
And what does ECD stand?
Economic Community Development. And I believe there's the announcement of a new director, wasn't there?
Coming October 3rd.
Right. So Mayor Cooper is treating the Economic Development Office differently than previous mayors. Previous mayors have treated the Economic Development Director as their chief negotiator in large economic deals. And Mayor Cooper has treated the office, asked the office to focus on small business economic development, largely because I think he's directly involved in doing negotiating himself more so than prior mayors. There's a Deputy Mayor, Sam Wilcox, who joined the office last March, I believe, is involved in the negotiations. Metro Legal is involved. They've obviously been involved in different stadium deals. There's, I think, 2 different outside law firms that are advising, one in town, one out of town, that's got experience with stadium and real estate developments. I think that's largely the team, along with a dose of the planning department for the East Bank ramifications and the finance department about how to pay for it.
Perfect. We have a lot of wonderful questions here as well. The first one is, can a public referendum be forced before approval?
The answer is no on that. State law is designed to allow public referendums for general obligation bonds, but not revenue bonds. And the original stadium that's there now was built with general obligation bonds, for which there is an opportunity for a public referendum. With sports authority revenue bonds, state law does not have any mechanism whatsoever for a referendum. So based on what we know about the deal, there's no referendum opportunity for the stadium. Now, depending on what the mayor ends up announcing for paying for the non-stadium infrastructure on the East Bank, that theoretically is got the potential to be subject to a referendum.
The next question is, Nashville built a new convention center during the last recession. Construction provided a lot of jobs and the recession ended, and then the designated sales taxes paid the bonds and created a surplus. Is it possible the economics of this could work similarly?
So, the question, the commenter makes the point that the revenue pool that was created to pay for the convention center started generating massive surpluses, more than anybody would have wanted, mostly because nobody imagined that downtown would be what it's become. And so the question is whether the same thing could happen now. I think not. And part of that is a component of the deal that the public hasn't really heard about yet, because the team and the mayor's office have chosen not to talk about it, is these revenue streams about the sales tax and the 130 acres and the hotel occupancy tax are designed for this deal to not just pay for the stadium, but to pay for capital improvements into however long that stadium is around. And so they are, by design, trying to create what any of us would consider to be a massive surplus of tax revenue that they're going to capture, because I think, and this is just a fact and people could apply their own values, they are assuming that there will be massive dollar requirements to keep up and modernize a $2 billion stadium. And so they are trying to create revenue streams that are enormous. And I think the goal is to keep them, well, by state law, they're going to be required to keep all that revenue with paying for the stadium and subsequent capital improvements.
David, we have one question here from the audience. If we could.
Hi, my name's Howard Allen. I'm Howard Allen. I'm a Nashvilleian, born and raised here. I've seen a lot of things where we had a Church Street Mall that didn't even last for 10 years, and that's the Nashville Library. And I want to know, we have a bunch of people that are considered low income, very low income, that are homeless. And right now, they're not arresting any of us. But if we get this stadium going, will they arrest us then and use some of that money because we become property and they make money off of inmates? So I want to know, will that happen? Because me personally, I think we're here, and it's kind of, I'm here to really just listen, but I know this is a done deal. They're going to do this stadium, And so we're sitting here listening like we're being played when they're going to get paid, And so we're going to have illusion without inclusion when you start arresting us, because I know it's going to happen just soon, especially if this stadium goes in. And do you have any realtors that are looking for property right now?
And thank you, Howard Allen, for your op-ed that appeared today in the Sunday Insight. So go read, get the Tennessean and read his op-ed on homelessness. I do want to go to the next question. Thank you for your statement. The Tennessean quoted the administration mayor saying something to the effect, "We will create 4 great neighborhoods on the East Bank." How should the citizens of Nashville hear this, particularly in light of many current neighborhoods that are not that quote-unquote great?
Paulette's going to have a better answer. I mean, I've got an answer. Well, I mean, I think that's the core thing that I think, especially as you get farther from downtown and people don't see the East Bank or go by the East Bank all the time. I think, we're going to end up having a proposal to build a sparkling new neighborhood from scratch. It's gonna, I think the proposal, my prediction is it's a proposal to keep about half the property tax revenue from the East Bank in the East Bank to pay to make it look magical. And we may end up doing that if that's what the majority of citizens want. But I would also venture a guess that every neighborhood in this city would love to keep half their property tax revenue in the neighborhood for sidewalks and road improvements. And we all know that's impossible, otherwise the city goes broke. And so one of the things we'll have to wrestle with is do we want football, where the average cost of attendance for a family of 4 is $800 a game, and again, scientific studies, not mine, show that the people who buy tickets are, above average income levels. Is that what we want where we want to invest that money, or do other neighborhoods get a shot at keeping half the property tax at home? And I mean, at this point, I'm just asking questions, but it reflects what I hear from folks.
Sure. And in that vein, Paulette, I'm wondering if I could include you in this conversation. Having studied Nashville's history, where people who lived in Cleveland Park or McFerrin Park or even Shelby Park, it was a far different community economically than it was before, and you've seen displacement, especially of communities of color. And could you talk a little bit about, in terms of how we frame our own narrative as Nashville, given the fact that you may see a substantial demographic shift if these neighborhoods come?
I think how we're framing, I think how we're framing our narrative now, if you look at the Imagine East Bank proposal, it's really inspiring, it's really encouraging, but when you get beneath the surface, there isn't very much that's going to benefit Nashville as a whole. And that's the problem, that we take a geographically targeted, so for example, we started with downtown. Now we're expanding it to the East Bank, and we're forgetting about those communities that already exist. Gentrification is very, very real. I'm encouraged in terms of East Bank having more possibilities, because a significant part of it is not habitable land, or is not, there are no residences, is a better way of saying it. So all of this for me, again, with my people, housing, equity, and justice focus, is very troubling. And there's no way that we can begin to have a portion of property taxes go only to that area. I mean, that begins to get into segmenting and dividing, and that's not just a good way to do it. We've done it, though, with regard to downtown, and the question is, do we want to continue doing it?
Thank you. We have a question from Lawrence Vanderberg. Are you here? There we go. It's a great question. Thank you. I'm in 2nd grade at Warner Elementary. My question is, why can't the city invest $2 billion in my school?
Exactly. There is no political will to do what is necessary in terms of equity and justice. For whatever reasons, and it's not unique to Nashville, we derive more pleasure, more, I don't know, more identity, affirmation, when we have all of these glitzy projects, as opposed to taking care of the basic quality of life issues that impact us. That's the problem. And as I stated before, when we prioritize and have the energy and the money and all levels of people that we do have engaged in the promotion of sports around education, and I think the other piece of it is it's easy to other around housing and education, health, et cetera. Because those people who are beneficiaries of things like the stadium, they have good schools, or they send their children to private school. Similarly with housing, so there's this basic and fundamental non-desire to sort of each of us be our brothers and sisters keepers, and our brothers and sisters protectors, and our brothers and sisters guardians of good quality of life.
I was wondering if I could turn to Mandy for a moment. There was a big reform of education finance this past year, which is shifting the way that local school systems are being funded. In the context, I know there's what we could talk about this ad nauseum for a while, but in the context of this question about whether or not schools will benefit because of the state formula, can you give us a sense of how it might affect Nashville? The TISA, the Tennessee Investment in
Right,
Student
so
Achievement.
Right, so we're shifting from what is called a resource-based formula, which is based on all these assumptions about how many teachers each child needs and how much square footage you need and all this stuff, and it spits out a number, to a student-based funding formula, which is based on this idea that there is a standard amount of money for every student, and then if you have a student with a special unique learning need or an economically disadvantaged student, that you should get a little bit more money to educate those children. And so we're shifting, and of course there's more money being put into the formula overall by the state. So there are no losers per se in the traditional sense, but there are certainly winners and winners, winners and winners, winners, winners. And Nashville is more in the winners category of expected to get more money, but not as much more as many other districts around the state will get from the new formula.
Very good. Well, we want to make sure that you're in the state legislature a few decades from now to get that money into the school system. There's a question about inclusion. If the administration were intentional about ensuring more inclusion in the economic growth, could the stadium prove beneficial to the city? And what would your vision of inclusion look like when it comes to deals like this?
Oh, for me, it would have a very, very strong business, particularly small business development component. It would have a very, very strong affordable housing component. It would make sure that other than the traditional deal makers are involved in the negotiations, there would be considerably more transparency than is the case now. All of these things, for me, would make the deal better. It takes longer and it's more frustrating because when you engage more people with all kinds of orientations and backgrounds, it just takes time. But I think that's the kind of thing that we need. We also, as a city, need to define and understand and wrap our arms around what it means to be a just city in 2022 and beyond.
I'd be hard pressed to improve on that answer. The one thing I would add is that I've believed for a while now, and I've told the mayor's office, everybody in Metro who I can get a hold of, that what we need as a city is a policy of how many dollars like this do we want to invest, and what do we want to incentivize and where? Because I think the what we want to incentivize and the where it goes to equity and inclusion, because let's face it, like all this spending does is hop the river from where the last very large batch of money has been spent. And without a policy in place about how much we want to spend on economic development, how much in property tax dollars, how much in sales tax dollars do we want to spend on either new neighborhoods or football, then it makes all these conversations more difficult, because you either get people who are opposed to all of it because they haven't gotten a piece of the pie, or it leads to wanting to have sort of unlimited spending because you try to solve the inclusion by doing it a whole bunch of other places. And somewhere, somehow, like having an actual policy of what kind of money we want to spend on, whether it's economic development or sports, entertainment, and where and what, there are people around this town who are trying to get all our public high schools to have new football stadiums, and the total price tag to get, not football stadiums, football fields, because they're in abysmal shape. And across the city, they're in bad shape. And the total project would be like $10–15 million, and we can't figure out how to get new football fields for our high schools. And that, creates a little bit of a disconnect when you're talking about equity and inclusion.
There's a question specifically to you, Councilman, and it says leases can be renegotiated. What are possible options for this once you get the latest report back on the stadium's condition?
Well, so I think a lot of you know, in my day job, I negotiate as a lawyer, not things as much as this, but I've been involved in negotiations over several $100 million. And what it would require is playing a game of chicken with the team, and fundamentally daring them to leave if you wanted to renegotiate the lease. Now that is, when I give advice as a lawyer, like it's not my money, and some business person gets to decide one way or the other whether they feel like playing chicken or whether they feel like let's make a deal. And as a city, the mayor's office, on some level, as far as any of us can tell, who knows what's going on behind closed doors, as far as any of us can tell, they've concluded that they want to play let's make a deal, and that's what they're doing. And so any lease negotiation would say, hey boys, you haven't exercised that option to 2039 yet, so right now your lease expires in 2027, I think it is, and there ain't a new stadium and we're not doing it, so shrug, and see what happens. I doubt, I don't know whether that's the right choice for the city. That's what it would take, and it would be, it would change the character of it a lot. So I'm not suggesting it's a good idea, but that's what it would take, is basically playing a game of chicken with the team.
Thank you. Yes, Mindy.
Just to add a little something here, I've been thinking about, this has very much been framed as a Nashville owes everything and gets no opportunity, or Nashville invests in this new stadium and gets everything out of it. I was actually on a different panel with the Titans CEO, and the question framed to him was, is bigger always better? And he came back with, the question is not is bigger always better here, it's is better better. Because it is very much framed as we pay $2 billion as a city to bring the old stadium up to snuff, and we get no access to the parking lots because that's what the current lease looks like. And so it is, we pay for everything, we get no new opportunity on the East Bank, or we pay everything for the new thing and we get all the opportunity on the East Bank. And that's very much how the whole East Bank vision has been sort of all tangled together. And I guess, from my perspective, these are all, once you bring taxpayer dollars into it, these are all political decisions. And even on that panel, I sort of challenged that those are not necessarily the only two options. Sure, there are there's legal language in the leases and all that, but it was a political decision to enter into a lease that looked like that. It was a political decision to allow the Titans to have ownership essentially of the parking lots. And so everything between those two options is still very much a political decision, because we're talking about taxpayer dollars here.
Thank you.
Just say, I'm sorry, one thing. I wanted to make sure everyone knew, I'm Marley Albert, Economic Equity and Jobs Task Force. I'll get here in a minute. Before I let Ray ask a question, I wanted y'all to know we did invite Burke Nihill with the Tennessee Titans, or someone from them. We had some council members help us reach out as well. They were not able to find anyone in their organization to come today. This won't be the last conversation. We want this to ongoing, but I just wanted all y'all to know we didn't try to set them up. This was no surprise. They knew this event was happening today. Here you go, Ray.
My wife and I drove to Brentwood this morning for lunch with friends from out of town. I thought maybe Williamson County had been evacuated as I saw the cars driving out of there into Nashville. And my wife reminded me there was a football game going on, which is why the traffic was there. I want to know, where did I sign up to provide entertainment for surrounding counties and be charged for it and not want to go myself? So help explain to me why we're providing entertainment for a group of people who just evacuate their own communities and come to ours. I don't understand it.
Well, when I was 30 years old and had lived in Nashville for 9 months, there was this referendum in 1996, and that's where you signed up for it. And so, listen, like there is a lease obligation. The decision was made to build a concrete stadium for about $300 million, and Metro has the entire capital expense obligation, and that is some dollar amount Now, the team has not exercised the option yet. They say they would. So it's not clear what that dollar amount is, but there is Metro on legal documents after a referendum approved by the council, signed by the mayor, is on the hook for a substantial obligation that is the only thing that makes this an interesting question economically about what to do. Because if it weren't for that lease obligation, then signing up for this much public spending, more than any city and state has ever done ever in America, I think would be completely dead in the water. And we hear the team and the mayor's office ride hard. Like whatever happened in the '90s, that was a generation ago. But no, heck, that's where we're at. So we got to do what we got to do. And people are going to continue to question that. People are going to continue to ask the sort of things that you asked. But I think that's when you signed up for it back then.
We've got one more question here from the audience.
Hi, thank you. I just two comments. One, I just want to say we've talked a lot about affordable housing. We hear a lot about affordable housing, but we need affordable housing at the 30 and 40 and 50% AMI. And there's a lot that passes as incentives to developers as affordable housing that is not. And there are some council members here who are passing those incentives, and we are aware of it as a community, and we know you are up for re-election. So I want to say that. Second, I want to say that indigenous people, native people, have been asking about the native Nashville history there and the archaeological history there. That has not been addressed in any form. And how are the native people and all that history being addressed? That's what I want to know. So, and Emerson had a question also. Why are we building a stadium if people need houses? That's what he was asking.
And we got Emerson's question right here too, so thank you over there.
I think the indigenous question, a lot of you'll remember there was a plan to build a high-rise residential development out where the old Sound Stadium is, and it turned out there's formerly enslaved people in the ground underneath there, and so now it's a World UNESCO site rather than residential buildings, and like this is not something I'm an expert on, but I understand that as different parts of development have happened with the interstate went in over there. There's a record of there being indigenous sites on that side of the river. Now the whole thing is concrete, but it's a pretty thin layer of concrete, and so it doesn't go below ground, below grade. I think one could expect if people want to go below grade, they may find remains or artifacts or I don't know what. Unlike out at the Sound Stadium, I think the idea is going to be to build up. It's a floodplain too. It's a floodplain since the inception of eternity till now. And I think the planning department plans on getting it to a higher grade, which may keep people from digging too far into the ground. So it's definitely an issue that I think is going to have to be watched. I think state law is actually such that if contractors run into remains or artifacts that they have to stop. So I don't know much about it beyond that.
I know that we're coming to the conclusion now. We want to thank everybody for their questions and for their comments. I want to turn it over to Morley and her team just to take us to this conclusion. First of all, I just want to thank all of our panelists, Paulette Coleman, Bob Mendes, and Benny Pellegrin. Can we give them a round of applause? Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Again, for being here. Again, Marley Albert, NOAA's Economic Equity and Jobs Task Force Leader. And I'm here with?
My name is Dami. I'm organized for Stand Up Nashville. Okay, so to end this out, if y'all haven't already, if y'all could just scan the QR code that's on this paper and fill out their information so we can just keep y'all updated on the conversation that's going on now.
We wanted to make sure you all know that this is not a one and done conversation. As we heard, this deal isn't finished yet. We believe there's a lot of questions. We're out today to begin that conversation. It will also continue in just a few weeks. So there are other papers that are being passed out. One is NOAA has a large public meeting. We used to do this for COVID, and we're bringing it back live again, October 9th at Jefferson Street Missionary Baptist Church. We're going to have a public meeting for everyone to attend. And one of our questions is going to be about this very idea, what is a stadium? And Mayor Cooper has agreed that he will be at this meeting. So we would love to have you all come, Jefferson Street Baptist Church at 3 o'clock on Sunday, October 9th. That conversation will continue there. And then we also have monthly meetings. NOAA's Economic Equity and Jobs Task Force does. So if you sign up on that QR code, give us your information, we'll be able to continue to get information out to you about this. Thank you again so much for coming. If you have more questions, please holler at us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula.
Thank you, good job.
So good to see you.
Thank you for your information.
Hey, Counselor, how you doing?
Op-ed for you.
Yes, of course.
On transgender kids. So can I can send it to you this afternoon?
Yes.
You want it? I just want to give it
Let me hang on one second.
Versus political question, I meant for the Titans, like if the Titans wanted to say, here, you can have the parking lots back, and, because this is a great city and we want to be a part of it, they could easily do that.
I still haven't come up with a good way to capture it, but and I'm going to do a bad job now, but the tenor of the negotiations is so insulting. It's like, I'm going to exercise my unilateral option to extend the lease by 11 years, which is going to create a $1 billion obligation on you. You're so screwed, but because I'm a nice guy, let's do something different next time.
That is exactly,
Maybe,
that is perfect.
maybe I am getting better.
That's perfect.
But that's that dynamic of it, like, is insulting.
Have I got a deal for you?
Let me punch you in the face about 10 times. And like, oh, are you okay?
And you'll like it.
Let's get you some help. Hey, how are you?
My darling over here.